In a couple other videos when I made these new clamping accessories for my CNC table, I also showed this cutting board as a clamping example. And a lot of you asked if I couldn't show how it gets surfaced because that's why I made these clamps for. But this cutting board I made about 3 years ago and it's been in use every day since, and it really doesn't need flattening. But I would also really like to see how the CNC would flatten a cutting board, so I made this one. This was actually just a scrap board of spruce and it won't be an actual cutting board when it's done. I just made this to do some tests with and, well, good opportunity to test the flattening. This is actually straight out of the clamp and it still has a lot of glue squeeze out, so I first need to get rid of that to make sure that it sits relatively flat on the table to begin with. And I usually do that with a chisel or a hand plane. Hand plane works definitely better. Now I can turn it around. And I rather use 3 of these because you never know what vibrations can do. Alright, I'm just using a regular 20mm router bit for this, so it shouldn't take that long. Alright, it's done and looking pretty good. Of course, when you take a closer look, that's far from being a good surface, but remember, that's spruce. And I also wasn't really careful when cutting these strips because the tests I made this for aren't really dependent on a nice surface. I also knew that it would splinter out at the edges, and now I roughly know by how much, though I think it will behave differently on hardwood. But what really matters is if it's flat. And I can't feel or hear any rocking. Some of you may think this is not a good reference surface, so let's take it to something that I know is flat, which would be the sliding table of my saw. And also here I can't hear or feel any rocking. So either it's perfectly even or unnoticeably uneven. And you would have to sand the surface anyways. If this was an actual cutting board, I would turn it around and do the same thing to the other side, but I won't because that's just boring video. Just as a reminder, I removed about 0.6mm from this surface, and now try to imagine you would have to do this with a sander. 0.6mm of end grain, even with the suited sander like a drum sander, would take quite a bit and would produce a lot of dust. And I don't even want to think about how long it would take with just a handheld sander, and that's just one phase. So this really saves a lot of time. Now probably most of you will say that I don't have a CNC machine. Thanks for showing, but that wasn't really helpful. And well, yeah, it's true, but you don't need a CNC to do that. You could do the same thing with a handheld router and a flattening jig setup. That's much simpler than it sounds like. Just search for flattening a board with a router and then you will see what I mean. But now enough of that, time for some shop upgrades. So I've got another tool that I want to hang on the wall. The simplest solution would probably be this here. But I don't really like this because this is not totally safe up there and it also is a little bit in the way. I really like having no obstacles in the way when putting back a drill, so I can either lift it up or slide it in and I'm not limited in any way. So I think I'd rather make a holder that's more like this one. With the first dowel in place, I can now figure out the second hole position. Probably here. That should work. my bandsaw blade started to leave some burn marks on pieces, and I also couldn't feed as fast anymore or it would start to drift away. So that means that it's getting a little dull and needs resharpening. Well, it's resharpened and took me a little under 7 minutes, but that's with rearranging the camera angle. And if I would do it without recording, it would take me like 5 minutes and it costs nothing. I'll also leave you a link in the video description to the video where I found this sharpening method, and there it's also explained in much more detail. I also get asked from time to time how my homemade bandsaw wheels are holding up, and well, they are in perfect condition. No damage whatsoever. The tires are in perfect condition, the bearings are in perfect condition. There's only a little bit more vibration compared to when I made them, because these being made out of MDF, they can still absorb moisture even with 3 coats of varnish. And it may got heavier on one side, so let's see if it needs rebalancing. But I only have easy access to the upper wheel, so I'll only check that one. I still have these little plugs that I made for balancing these wheels, and with these I can put it on an 8mm shaft. Well, and now I just look for heavy points. And as you can see, there is a heavy point, so I need to remove a little bit more material here. As I don't have any tools to measure this, it's basically just a trial and error with removing material. If I also wanted to rebalance the lower wheel, I would have to remove the motor because of the belt tension, and well, that's just not worth it. But as you can see, it still runs really nicely. If you take a look at this little ring I balanced here, it did not fall. And I almost forgot to coat this freshly exposed MDF with lacquer. I also think it's time for a new insert plate. But this time I'm a little smarter and make more than just one. I finished this little piece here, and if I do everything right, I should get 7 inserts out of that. Perfect. The other day when I was gluing up these panels with my homemade clamps, I had one of them and the handle started to slip when I was tightening pretty hard. As you can see, they all have a cross pin through them, and here this little pin just sheared off because it was too small. And a clamp that starts to fail is the last thing you need when you glue up some very valuable walnut. So to make sure that that will never happen again, I will now replace all of these pins with some much larger ones. Note that when I'm pulling the nails out, my fingers are in a safe position in case I slip off with this tool here. Then I can drive in one of these nails and cut it off. And now filing down the leftover. No. No. Yeah, that one. Alright, these clamps are back in business. Sometimes I wish I was taller. But then again, no. And it really doesn't need flattening. course, when you take a closer look, that's far from being a good surface. Here. Oops. Because the tests I made this for are not really dependent on a nice surface. Oh, that should work. But you can't see it. Great. And I don't even want to think about how long it... And I don't even want to think about how one... And I don't even want to think about how one...